This is chapter 13 for Anatomy and Physiology 1. This is talking about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So functionally, the spinal cord is very important. The spinal cord and its spinal nerves are going to be responsible for mediating reactions to any kind of environmental changes. The spinal cord is going to have several different functions. The first is going to be to process various reflexes in the body. It's also going to be the site for integrating either excitatory postsynaptic potentials or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials that arise locally or that are triggered by nerve impulses from the periphery and the brain. And then it's also going to be important as a conduction pathway for sensory information to the brain and for motor impulses to effectors. So let's look at the anatomy of the spinal cord for a minute. The spinal cord is going to be, it's going to have two main protective layers that are made up of connective tissue. These are the meninges and the vertebra, and then there's also going to be a cushion of cerebrospinal fluid in there as well. So there are really three layers of total of protection there. The vertebral column is going to provide a bony covering for the spinal cord. And then the protective meninges are going to be three layers or three coverings that are going to run continuously around both the spinal cord and the brain. And the layers of the meninges that are found around the spinal cord are also the same as what you would find around the brain. So the outermost layer is called the dura mater. Then the middle layer is the arachnoid mater, and then the innermost meningeal layer is going to be the pia mater. So that pia mater is also going to have something called denticulate ligaments, and these are going to be thickenings of that pia mater that are going to be there to help suspend the spinal cord in the middle of that dural sheath. So it's kind of helping to hold it in the middle and stabilize it around with those meninges around it there. And then beneath our arachnoid mater and the subarachnoid space, this is where we're going to find that cerebrospinal fluid that's going to offer a little extra cushioning. It's also going to provide some filtration, etc. So as far as the external anatomy of the spinal cord is concerned, the spinal cord is going to begin as an extension of the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen magnum in the head, and it's going to terminate at about the second lumbar vertebra in an adult. This is obviously a little bit different in children or in infants. The spinal cord is going to contain cervical and lumbar enlargements that you can see here. Cervical and lumbar enlargements that are going to serve as a point of origin for nerves to the extremities. So if you think about the amount of nerves that are going to have to come out of the spinal cord, it's going to be the largest at this cervical and the lumbar regions. So that's why you've got these sort of enlargements here, because of these extra nerves, this extra traffic, if you will, nervous traffic. So you're going to have this sort of enlargement. The tapered portion of the spinal column is called the conus medullaris, and from this is what we're going to see is where we're going to have arise the filum terminale as well as the cauda equina. So the filum terminale is going to be an extension of the pia mater, one of those meningeal layers, that innermost layer, and this is going to extend inferiorly, and it's going to fuse with the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, and it's going to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx. The cauda equina, on the other hand, is going to be the roots of the lower spinal nerves that are angled inferiorly along the filum terminale in the vertebra, in the vertebral canal, like kind of wisps of hair. So cauda equina means horsehair. So if you look at the bottom part of a spinal cord, it does look a little bit like a horse's tail, with all of those spinal nerves kind of coming off of the end there. So that's the cauda equina. So moving on to the internal anatomy of the spinal cord, the anterior median fissure, as well as the posterior median sulcus are going to penetrate the white matter of the spinal cord and are going to divide it into left and right sides. The gray matter of the spinal cord is going to be shaped kind of like the letter H, or maybe like a butterfly, depending on, I guess, how you look at it. And then this is going to be surrounded by white matter. So the gray matter is going to consist primarily of cell bodies of neurons and neuroglia, as well as unmyelinated axons and dendrites of the association and motor neurons. The white matter is going to consist of bundles of myelinated axons of motor and sensory neurons. So the gray commissure is going to form the crossbar of the H-shaped gray matter, sort of this thing in the middle here, our gray commissure here. And the center of the gray commissure is going to have the central canal, which is going to run the length of the spinal cord, and it contains the cerebrospinal fluid. Anterior to the gray commissure is going to be the anterior white commissure, and this is going to connect the white matter of the left and the right sides of the spinal cord. So we can divide the gray and the white matter into individual parts separately. So the gray matter is going to be divided into horns, and these are going to contain cell bodies of neurons. The white matter, on the other hand, is divided into columns. And each column is going to contain a distinct bundle of nerve axons that are going to have a common origin or a common destination, and these are going to carry similar information. So these bundles are going to be called tracts. There's going to be two different types of tracts. There is the sensory or ascending tract that's going to conduct nerve impulses from the perimeter of the peripheral areas of the body towards the brain, and then the motor or descending tract, which is going to conduct impulses down the spinal cord. So the internal anatomy of the spinal cord is really nicely organized because it allows for sensory and motor information to be processed in a very organized way. And so we're going to take a look at that, at the steps that are involved in that here. So the first thing that has to happen is that sensory receptors are going to detect sensory stimuli. And then those sensory nerves, or sensory neurons, are going to convey this sensory input in the form of that nerve impulse along their axons, which extend from the sensory receptors into the spinal nerves, and then into the posterior root. From the posterior root, those axons of the sensory neurons can proceed along one of three possible paths. The first option is that axons of the sensory neurons may extend into the white matter of the spinal cord and then ascend it to the brain as part of that sensory tract. The second option is that axons of sensory neurons may enter the posterior gray horn and synapse with interneurons whose axons are going to extend into the white matter of the spinal cord and then ascend into the brain as part of a sensory tract. And then our third possible path is that the axons of sensory neurons may enter that posterior gray horn and synapse with interneurons that in turn synapse with somatic motor neurons that are involved in spinal reflex pathways, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in this lecture. So from there, once one of these pathways has occurred, the motor output from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscles is going to involve somatic motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. Many of these somatic motor neurons are regulated by the brain, and axons from higher brain centers form motor tracts that descend from the brain into the white matter of that spinal cord. There, they are going to synapse with the somatic motor neurons either directly or indirectly by first synapsing with interneurons that in turn synapse with those somatic motor neurons. And then finally, last but not least, when these are activated, the somatic motor neurons are going to convey motor output in the form of nerve impulses along those axons, which are then subsequently going to pass through the anterior gray horn and the anterior root to enter the spinal nerve. And then from that spinal nerve, the axons of the somatic motor neurons are going to extend to skeletal muscles in the body. Once this occurs, the motor output from the spinal cord to the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and the glands is going to involve autonomic motor neurons in the lateral gray horn. When activated, the autonomic motor neurons are going to convey motor output in the form of nerve impulses along their axons, which are then going to pass through the lateral gray horn, the anterior gray horn, and the anterior root to enter that spinal cord, or that spinal nerve, excuse me. And then from the spinal nerve, axons of the autonomic motor neurons from that spinal cord are going to synapse with another group of autonomic motor neurons that are located in the peripheral nervous system. The axons of this second group of autonomic motor neurons in turn are going to synapse with cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and the glands of the body. So here we have just a nice little table looking at a comparison of the various spinal cord segments and their distinguishing characteristics. So now that we've talked about the spinal cord itself, let's look at the spinal nerves that go with that. The spinal nerves are going to connect the central nervous system to the sensory receptors, the muscles, and the glands, and all throughout the body, and all of these are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves are named and numbered according to the regions and the level of the spinal cord from which they emerge. So there are going to be 8 pairs of cervical nerves up here, 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and then 1 coccygeal nerve. These spinal nerves are going to be the path of communication between the spinal cord and then most of the rest of the body. The roots are going to be the 2 points of attachment that are going to connect those spinal nerves to the segments of the spinal cord. The dorsal or posterior which is the sensory portion, is going to contain sensory nerve fibers that conduct nerve impulses from the periphery into the spinal cord. The posterior or the dorsal root ganglia, which you can see here, this kind of big knobby bit, is going to contain the cell bodies for the sensory neurons from the periphery. So this dorsal root ganglion right here, contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. That's really important. All right. It's also a really kind of handy little landmark to just sort of help to orient yourself as far as what you're looking at when you're looking at the spinal cord. Anyhow, the anterior or the ventral root is going to be responsible for the motor aspect of the nervous system, and it's going to contain motor neuron axons, and it conducts impulses from the spinal cord to the periphery. And the cell bodies of these motor neurons are going to be located in the gray matter of the cord. So let's look then at the connective tissue coverings for the spinal cord, just real briefly. The spinal nerve axons are going to be grouped within these connective tissue sheaths, just like what we would kind of see, similar to how we would see a muscle tissues or muscle fibers. So the fibers of a single axon are going to be found within an endoneurium. The fascicle is going to be a bundle of fibers within a perineurium. And then a nerve is going to be a bundle of fascicles within an epineurium. And then blood vessels are going to be found within these connective tissue coverings. So this is sort of what holds it all together to make one big unit of a nerve. So then looking at the branches of the spinal nerves, shortly after passing through those intervertebral foramina, a spinal nerve is going to divide into several different branches, and these branches are called rami. Branches of spinal nerves are going to include the dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, the meningeal branch, as well as the rami communicantes, which we mentioned in a previous lecture. The anterior rami of spinal nerves T2 through T12, or thoracic 2 through thoracic 12, do not enter the foramina. Do not enter into the formation of plexuses. Those kind of clusters or groups of nerves that have a similar function. These guys are instead going to be known as intercostal or thoracic nerves. These nerves are going to directly innervate structures, and they're going to supply. These nerves are going to directly innervate structures they supply in the intercostal space. The posterior rami are going to supply the deep back muscles and the skin of the posterior aspect of the thorax. And then the ventral rami of these spinal nerves, except for T2 through T12, which we mentioned, are going to form a network of nerves called plexuses, or a plexus for singular. And we'll talk about these plexuses in a little bit later in the lecture. So that brings us then to dermatomes. So these are certain segments of skin that are going to be supplied by spinal nerves that carry somatic sensory nerve impulses to the brain. So for these dermatomes, the skin over the entire body is going to be supplied by somatic motor neurons, or somatic sensory neurons, and these are going to carry nerve impulses from the skin into the spinal cord and the brain. So each spinal nerve is going to contain sensory neurons that have a specific and predictable segment of the body. So one of the cranial nerves, the trigeminal nerve, is going to serve most of the skin of the face and the scalp. And then the area of the skin that provides sensory input to the central nervous system via one pair of spinal nerves or the trigeminal nerve is called a dermatome. So the nerve supply in adjacent dermatomes is going to overlap somewhat. And knowing which spinal cord segment supplies each dermatome makes it possible to locate damage to regions of the spinal cord. So if the skin of a dermatome region is stimulated by the sensation is not perceived, then that it would indicate that the nerves supplying that dermatome are possibly damaged. So just sort of a fun little interesting side bit about these dermatomes. You can see there's a lot of overlap here. So if you've ever gotten a Brazilian wax, where they put that hot wax all down there, sometimes when they put that hot wax down there, you feel kind of a warm sensation in your baby toes, your little pinky toes. And it's because of this dermatome, of this overlap of dermatomes, because the spinal nerves that are responsible for serving or innervating or stimulating the regions of your little baby toes, your pinky toes, are going to be the same as what's going to be down here in some of this genital area. So that's just sort of an interesting example of how dermatomes work. But they, like it does say, they are also really useful in identifying regions of damage in the spinal cord. But anyhow, so now we're going to take a minute and look at the various plexuses or plexuses in the body. The first plexus that we're going to discuss is the cervical plexus. This is going to supply the skin and muscles of the head, neck, and upper parts of the shoulders, and it connects with some of the cranial nerves as well as supplying the diaphragm. Nerves that bear the name that nerves that bear names often are often going to be descriptive of the general region that they supply or the course that they're going to take to emerge from that plexus. So damage to the spinal cord above the origin of the phrenic nerve, which is between C3 and C5, is going to cause a respiratory arrest. So breathing is going to stop because the phrenic nerve is no longer able to send impulses to the diaphragm. So here we just have a little table just generally describing the parts of the nerves that are associated with the cervical plexus. You won't need to know these for the exam, but they are important for the lab exam. Next, we have the brachial plexus. This is going to constitute the nerve supply for the upper extremities, as well as a number of neck and shoulder muscles. So you can see them here, the upper extremities, and then some of the neck muscles as well. And again, we have a cute little table looking at all of the nerves that are associated with the brachial plexus. Next, we have the lumbar plexus. This is going to supply the anterolateral abdominal wall, the external genitalia, and parts of the lower extremities. The largest nerve is going to arise from the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve, and an injury to the femoral nerve is indicated by an inability to extend the legs or a loss of sensation in the skin over the anterior-medial aspect of the thigh. So damage to some of these could be quite problematic sexually, as far as especially for the men. So here we have a table highlighting the nerves of the lumbar plexus. Next, we have the sacral plexus. This is going to supply the buttock, the perineum, as well as parts of the lower extremities. And the largest nerve that arises from the sacral plexus, as well as the largest nerve in the body, is the sciatic nerve. And that is often causes a lot of pain. It's kind of a pain in the lower back and the butt sort of area if you have sciatic nerve pain. So a little bit more about the sacral plexus. Injury to the sciatic nerve, which is a common, the perineal portion, as well as its branches are associated will result in something called sciatica, which is a pain that extends from the buttock down to the back of the leg. Sciatic nerve injuries can occur due to a herniated or slipped disc, as well as a dislocated hip. Sometimes osteoarthritis of the lumbosacral spine can put pressure on the sciatic nerve, as well as pressure from a uterus during pregnancy, or possibly from an improper administration of a gluteal injection or a shot in the butt. So all of these things can cause sciatic nerve pain or sciatic injury, which can be quite uncomfortable. So again, here we have our table with all of the parts of the sacral plexus. So let's look for a little bit now at the spinal cord physiology. In order to maintain homeostasis, the spinal cord has got to be able to propagate nerve impulses as well as integrate information. So how does this information travel in the spinal cord? Well, there's two main ways. The white matter tracts are going to conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain, and then the gray matter is going to receive and integrate incoming and outgoing information and perform spinal reflexes. So as far as the sensory and motor tracts, we're really not going to get too much into this. Just need to know that the sensory information from receptors is going to travel up the spine to the brain along two main routes on each side of the cord. We have the spinothalamic tracts and the posterior column tracts. And the motor information is going to travel from the brain down the spinal cord to the various effectors, the muscles, the glands, whatever, along two types of descending tracts, the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. That's all we're going to say about that. We're not going to get into any more detail about these tracts and pathways. So let's look now at the reflexes and the reflex arcs, because these are actually really interesting. So the spinal cord is going to serve as an integrating center for spinal reflexes, and these are going to occur in the gray matter. So a reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response to changes in the environment that help to maintain homeostasis. Reflexes may be spinal or cranial in location, as well as somatic or autonomic in function. So a reflex arc is going to be the simplest type of pathway. And this is a pathway these pathways are specific neural circuits and are therefore going to have at least one synapse. The reflexes are going to help maintain homeostasis by permitting the body to make very rapid adjustments to homeostatic imbalances, like if you step on a tack, or if you trip and have a reflex to prevent you from falling on your face. The very rapid adjustments to maintain homeostasis. So somatic spinal reflexes are going to include the stretch reflex, the tendon reflex, the flexor or withdrawal reflex, and then the cross extensor reflex. And all of these are going to exhibit reciprocal innervation. So let's look real quick at the just general components of the reflex arcs before we look at the individual reflex arcs themselves. So for starters, we have our sensory receptors. This is where the distal end of that sensory neuron, or the dendrite, or any kind of associated sensory structure, is going to serve as our sensory receptor. It's going to respond to a specific stimuli by producing a graded potential called either a generator potential or a receptor potential. It's the same thing, two different names, but they are the same. So if a generator potential reaches the threshold level of depolarization, it'll trigger a nerve impulse in the sensory neuron. So the second component of our reflex arc is the sensory neuron. So this is the nerve impulse. So as that nerve impulse propagates from the sensory receptor along the axon of the sensory neuron to the axon terminal, which are located in the gray matter of the spinal cord or in the brainstem. So from there, they're going to relay, neurons are going to send nerve impulses to the area of the brain that's going to allow for conscious awareness that the reflex has occurred. Right? Our next part of the reflex arc is going to be the integrating center. And so this is going to be one or more regions of gray matter within the central nervous system that are going to act as an integrating center. So in the simplest type of reflex, the integrating center is a single synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. And more often, the integrating center is going to consist of one or more interneurons, which may relay impulses to other interneurons as well as to the motor neuron. So our next part of the reflex arc is going to be the motor neuron, which you can see here. Our motor neuron. So the impulses are going to be triggered by the integrating center, and they're going to propagate out of the central nervous system along those motor neurons to whatever part of the body that needs to respond. And then last but not least, we have our effector. This is the muscle or gland or whatever part of the body, whatever tissue that's going to respond to that motor impulse. So this is the part of the body that responds to the motor nerve impulse, things like we said, muscles or glands, etc. And these are the effectors. And its action is going to be called a reflex. So if the effector is a skeletal muscle, the reflex will be a somatic reflex. And if the effector is going to be some sort of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or some sort of gland, then the reflex is an autonomic or a visceral reflex. So now before we get into these individual reflex arcs, we need to discuss some vocabulary terms. So first we have ipsilateral, and this is where the sensory nerve impulses are going to enter the spinal cord on the same side from which the motor nerve impulses leaves it. Right? And then contralateral is where the sensory impulses enter one side of the spinal cord and the motor impulse exits on the opposite side. So those two are opposites. Then we have our monosynaptic. This refers to a reflex pathway that only has one synapse in the central nervous system. And then polysynaptic, as you might have guessed, is a reflex pathway that has more than two types of neurons and has more than one central nervous system synapse. And then last but not least, we have our reciprocal innervation. And this is going to be where the components of a neural circuit are going to simultaneously cause contraction of one muscle and relaxation of its antagonist. Right? So just keep those in mind when we go through these various types of reflex arcs. So the first reflex arc that we have is the stretch reflex. This causes contractions of a muscle that has been stretched. So the stretch reflex is ipsilateral and is important in maintaining muscle tone as well as muscle coordination during exercise. So a two-neuron or monosynaptic reflex arc is going to contain one sensory neuron and has one motor neuron. And a stretch reflex, such as the patellar reflex, is a really nice example. So it's going to operate as a feedback mechanism to control muscle length by causing muscle contraction. So this stretch reflex is what they're testing when you go to the doctor's office and you sit on the table and they smack your knee with that little rubber hammer. That is the patellar reflex, and that is a type of stretch reflex. So let's look at the various components of the stretch reflex real quick. The slight stretching of a muscle is going to stimulate the sensory receptors in the muscle, those muscle spindles, which we discussed in a different lecture. The spindles are going to monitor changes in the length of the muscle. So the second thing that's going to happen is that in response to being stretched, those muscle spindles are going to generate one or more nerve impulse that propagates along a somatic sensory neuron through the posterior root of the spinal nerve and into the spinal cord. So then the third thing that happens is in the spinal cord or the integrating center, the sensory neuron is going to make an excitatory synapse with and thereby activate a motor neuron in the anterior gray horn. So if that excitation is strong enough, then one or more nerve impulses will arise in that motor neuron and are going to propagate along that axon, which is going to extend from the spinal cord into the anterior root and through the peripheral nerves to the stimulated muscle. So the axon terminals of the motor neurons are going to form neuromuscular junctions with skeletal muscle fibers of that stretched muscle. And then the last thing that's going to happen is that acetylcholine is going to be released by nerve impulses at that neuromuscular junction. And this is going to trigger one or more action potentials in that stretched muscle, which is the effector, and the muscle is going to contract. Therefore, muscle stretch is going to be followed by a muscle contraction, which is going to relieve that stretch. All right. So looking at that again, just breaking it down to the most simplest thing, the simple bare bones. We've got our first step is the stretch receptors being stimulated when you smack that hammer, right? It's going to excite our somatic sensory neurons, all right? So our sensory receptors in this case are the muscle spindles that are going to trigger some sort of, they're going to trigger or identify that stimulus which is being hit by the hammer, right? Then this is going to lead to the excitation of our sensory neurons, our somatic sensory neurons in this case, because it is a skeletal muscle. Then that information is going to go to the integrating center, which is within the spinal cord, and the sensory neurons are going to activate motor neurons, all right? And then from there, this integrating system is going to lead to the activation of our motor neurons, which are being excited, which leads to some sort of effect. In this case, the muscle is going to contract, causing the stretching of this muscle spindle to decrease or strip, right? So that is basically the stretch reflex, as simple as we can get it. Next is the tendon reflex. This is going to cause relaxation of a muscle that's attached to a stimulated tendon. So the tendon reflex is ipsilateral, and it exists in order to prevent damage to muscles and tendons as a result of stretching. So it operates as a feedback mechanism to control the muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation when muscle forces become too extreme. So if something is contracting too hard or stretching beyond its bounds, this reflex is going to trigger that muscle to relax. Next we have our flexor or withdrawal reflex. This is going to cause the withdrawal of a limb to avoid injury or pain, like if you step on a tack. It's a really great example of the withdrawal reflex, where you pick your foot up right after you've stepped on it a little bit. So the flexor or withdrawal reflex is going to be ipsilateral and is a protective withdrawal reflex that moves a limb to avoid pain. This reflex results in contraction of the flexor muscles to move a limb away from any kind of injury or painful stimuli. And it works with the cross extensor reflex to maintain balance as well. And it's important to mention that this flexor or withdrawal reflex is both polysynaptic and somatic in nature. So looking really quick at the steps that are involved in the withdrawal reflex. So step one is going to be stepping on the tack, is going to stimulate the dendrites, those sensory receptors for our pain-sensitive neurons. All right. The second step is going to be that sensory neuron is then going to generate a nerve impulse, which is going to propagate into the spinal cord. From there, within that spinal cord, which is where the integrating system center is, the sensory neurons are going to activate those interneurons that extend to several spinal cord segments. And then the interneurons are going to activate motor neurons in several of those spinal cord segments. And as a result, those motor neurons are going to generate a nerve impulse, or multiple nerve impulses, which can then propagate towards those axon terminals. Once that happens, acetylcholine is then released by the motor neurons, causing the flexor muscles in the thigh, in this case, which is the effector, to contract and withdraw the leg from that painful stimulus. This reflex is protective against. I'm sorry. This reflex is protective because contractor or contraction of that flexor muscle is going to move the limb away from the source of any kind of possibly damaging or dangerous stimuli, i.e. stepping on a tack, which we see down here. So our last reflex arc that we're going to mention just really quick is the cross extensor reflex. And this is to help to maintain balance during the withdrawal reflex, so that way when you're pulling your foot away from that painful stimuli, stepping on a tack, you don't just totally fall over. So this is a balance maintaining reflex that causes a synchronized extension of the joint in one limb and the flexion of the joint in the opposite limb. So the cross extensor reflex is a contralateral reflex, and it helps to maintain balance during our flexor reflex. So that is all that we have for this particular lecture. This is chapter 13 on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or ask during class.